Sandra had always been the kind of person who preferred to stay grounded. Despite her rising fame and the glitz of Hollywood, she was never one to get caught up in the chaos or drama of the entertainment industry. She was known for being kind, approachable, and always offering a warm smile. But it wasn't always easy. In the early days of her career, Sandra had to fight for recognition like many other actors. She wasn't born into a family of Hollywood elites, and she didn't have connections that could guarantee her success. She had to earn everything, from her roles to her place among the most talented actors in the industry. But she had one thing many others didn't, a relentless passion for her craft, and she was determined to prove herself. One evening, after finishing a long day on set, Sandra was invited to a high-profile industry event. It was one of those glamorous Hollywood galas where everyone rubbed elbows. Directors, producers, actors, and journalists all mingled together under the sparkling lights. Sandra wasn't one to seek attention, but she knew it was important to attend these kinds of events to build connections and make her presence known. When she arrived, the event was already in full swing. The room was filled with chatter, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. She entered with a few colleagues, but immediately felt the weight of all the eyes in the room. Everyone was looking, talking, and trying to figure out who was there. Despite the sea of people, Sandra didn't feel out of place. She'd been to enough events by now to know how to navigate them, smiling, making small talk, and trying to stay genuine in a world that often felt shallow. It wasn't long before she found herself standing near a group of directors and producers she'd heard about but hadn't yet met. One of them, known for his sharp tongue and controversial opinions, immediately noticed Sandra. At first he greeted her with a smile, but there was something about the way he looked at her that made Sandra feel uneasy. She had learned early on in Hollywood that not everyone who offered a friendly handshake had good intentions. The conversation started out harmless enough, with the director asking Sandra about her recent projects. She spoke politely about her work, always trying to keep the mood light and professional. But as the conversation continued, it started to take an uncomfortable turn. The director, whose reputation for speaking his mind was well known, made a casual comment about Sandra's acting skills. "You know," he said almost offhandedly, "I've never understood why people think you're such a big deal. Your performances are fine, I guess, but not exactly groundbreaking. You're just kind of there." Sandra's smile faltered for a second. She wasn't sure if it was meant as a joke or if he genuinely believed what he said, but the word stung. She had worked so hard to be where she was, and hearing such a dismissive comment from someone with that much influence hit harder than she expected. She tried to laugh it off, brushing it off with a forced chuckle. "Thanks for the feedback," she said, trying to keep the conversation light. "I'll be sure to keep it in mind for next time." But the director wasn't finished. He pressed on, not noticing or maybe not caring that his words were having an effect. "I mean, honestly, I don't see the appeal. People like you because you're nice, but what does that really mean in Hollywood? Everyone's nice. It's not enough to just be pleasant. You need something more, something unique." Sandra felt her stomach churn. The people around them were still talking, but now she was no longer part of the conversation. She felt small, like she was on the outside looking in. It was as if she had become the subject of a silent performance that she had no control over. Her mind raced, but she couldn't find the words to respond. She had heard criticism before, but something about this felt different. It wasn't constructive. It wasn't helpful. It was just cruel. And it stung because it came from someone who was supposed to be respected in the industry, someone whose opinion could open or close doors for an actor's career. But before she could say anything, someone else in the group, a producer she had met earlier in the evening, jumped in trying to change the subject. Sandra couldn't remember exactly what the producer said, but it was enough to pull the conversation in a different direction. She forced herself to smile again, nodding and trying to regain some sense of composure. Still, the damage had been done. As the evening wore on, Sandra couldn't shake the words from her mind. She kept thinking about the comment, playing it over and over in her head. She knew she shouldn't let it bother her. After all, there were always critics in this industry, and she had been dealing with them for years. But this time felt different. What made it worse was the fact that Sandra had been working so hard to prove herself. She had fought for every role, every opportunity, and had sacrificed so much to get where she was. To have someone dismiss her talent like that, especially someone who had the power to shape careers, felt like a blow to everything she had worked for. It wasn't just about the criticism of her acting. It was about the underlying message that being kind and approachable wasn't enough, that in Hollywood it was all about being exceptional, unique, and willing to do whatever it took to stand out. Sandra didn't say much about the incident to anyone. She didn't want to cause a scene or make it bigger than it was, but she couldn't help feeling disheartened as she made her way out of the event later that night. The excitement and energy she had felt when she first arrived had completely evaporated. The streets of Hollywood, once filled with promise, now felt empty. She drove home in silence, her thoughts consumed by the conversation. But as much as it bothered her, she knew she couldn't let it define her. Sandra had been through worse. There had been times in her career when she thought she might never make it. But somehow she had always managed to find a way forward. What she didn't know at the time was that her night, though difficult, would soon take a surprising turn. What she didn't know was that someone, a friend she had come to trust, had been watching closely. Someone who would soon remind her of what really mattered. Not the words of critics or the opinions of people who didn't understand her, but the support of those who truly cared. And in that moment, the seeds of a new chapter in her Hollywood journey were quietly being planted. One that would forever change the way Sandra viewed the industry, and the friendships that could help her thrive in it. As the days passed after the event, Sandra tried to push the hurtful comments to the back of her mind. She was no stranger to criticism in Hollywood, and she had learned over the years how to let most of it roll off her shoulders. But this time it felt different. It wasn't just the words themselves that bothered her. It was the way they seemed to capture something deep inside her, a doubt she hadn't realized was there. She spent the next few days working on her current film, trying to keep herself busy and focused. But the words of the director echoed in her mind, and she couldn't help but feel like they had left a mark. It wasn't like she was questioning her talent. Sandra knew she was good at what she did, but it was the feeling of being underestimated that stung. She couldn't shake the thought that despite all the effort, she still wasn't enough for some people. She had been working tirelessly to prove herself, but it felt like she was still constantly fighting to be seen, to be valued. During the next week, the crew was gearing up for another round of filming, and Sandra was in the makeup trailer preparing for a scene. It was one of those quiet moments before the madness of the day began. As she sat in front of the mirror, watching the makeup artist apply the final touches, she heard someone walk in behind her. Sandra turned, expecting to see one of her colleagues, but to her surprise, it was Keanu. Keanu was a familiar face in the industry, someone who had become a close friend to Sandra over the years. They had met on the set of Speed, and from that moment they had clicked. There was something genuine about Keanu, something that set him apart from many others in Hollywood. He wasn't the kind of person to chase fame or attention. Instead, he was focused on the work and on making connections with people who shared his values. Sandra always admired how humble and grounded he was, especially considering the immense success he had achieved. "Hey, how's it going?" Keanu asked as he approached her chair, his voice warm and easygoing. He had that way of making people feel comfortable no matter the situation. Sandra smiled, appreciating his easy presence. "Hey, Keanu, just getting ready for the scene. You know how it is." "Yeah, I get it," he said, nodding. "Long days, lots of prep. I won't keep you. But I wanted to check in, see how you're doing." Sandra looked at him, surprised by his question. They had worked together enough to know each other well, but Keanu was rarely the type to bring up personal matters. He was more about the work, always focused on getting the job done. But something about his tone told her that he wasn't just asking out of politeness. "I'm fine," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "Just busy, you know how it is." Keanu raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "You sure about that?" Sandra paused. She wasn't used to talking about her feelings, especially not with someone in the industry. But something about Keanu made it feel safe. Maybe it was his quiet confidence or the fact that he had always treated her like a friend, not just a colleague. She let out a deep breath. "Well, actually, I guess I'm not," she admitted. "It's just, there was this thing at the event last week. One of the directors said something and it's been bothering me ever since." Keanu's expression softened and he pulled up a chair next to her. "Do you want to talk about it?" Sandra hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should even bring it up. But Keanu's calm demeanor put her at ease, and she found herself telling him everything. The comments, how they made her feel, and the lingering doubt that had taken root in her mind. Keanu listened quietly, his face neutral, but there was a certain depth in his eyes, like he was taking in every word she said. When she finished, he sat there for a moment, letting the silence hang between them. "You know," he finally said, his voice steady, "I've been in this business long enough to know that people can be harsh. Some of them are just looking to tear others down because it makes them feel better about themselves. But I think you already know that." Sandra nodded. She had been in the business long enough to understand how competitive and sometimes cruel it could be. But hearing Keanu say it out loud somehow made it feel more real. It wasn't just a few bad apples in a big orchard. It was a pattern, something that was ingrained in the culture of Hollywood. "But here's the thing," Keanu continued, his gaze direct. "None of that matters. What you do, how you do it, and who you are, that's what matters. People will always try to tell you what you're not, but they don't know you. They don't know what's inside you." Sandra looked at him, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Keanu had this way of putting things that made everything seem clearer, even when it felt like the world was clouded with negativity. "You're not just fine," he said with a small smile. "You're more than that. You've got something real, something no one can take away from you. Don't let one person's opinion shake you." Sandra felt a lump form in her throat. It wasn't just what he said, it was the way he said it. Keanu wasn't trying to give her a pep talk or tell her everything would be okay. He wasn't dismissing her feelings. Instead, he was showing her something she had forgotten, the value of being true to herself. "Thanks, Keanu," she whispered, her voice a little shaky. "I needed to hear that." Keanu smiled, his eyes warm. "Anytime." They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the bustling set fading into the background. Sandra felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off her shoulders, if only for a little while. She was reminded of something she often forgot in the chaos of Hollywood: the importance of having people in her life who truly cared, who didn't just see her as another face in the crowd. As the makeup artist finished up and the crew started to gather for the next shot, Sandra stood up, feeling a little lighter. She knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. Hollywood was a tough place, and there would always be critics both online and in person. But as long as she had people like Keanu in her corner, she knew she could face whatever came her way. Keanu had given her something invaluable that day, not just advice, but the reminder that there were people in this industry who valued kindness and integrity over fame and recognition. He had made her realize that it wasn't about fighting to be seen by everyone. It was about staying true to herself and surrounding herself with people who saw her for who she really was. And with that simple, yet profound conversation, Sandra felt a shift inside her. The doubt that had crept into her heart began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. All she needed to do was keep doing what she loved, and the rest would fall into place. As she walked back to the set, ready to tackle the next scene, Sandra knew that things were about to change, not because of anything she had done, but because of the people who had helped her along the way. And in that moment, Sandra Bullock realized that the true value of success in Hollywood wasn't about being the best at everything. It was about the people you trusted, the friends who had your back, and the ones who stood up for you when you needed it most. A few days after Sandra's conversation with Keanu, something inside her began to shift. She had always prided herself on being strong and independent, but Keanu's words had opened her eyes in a way that nothing else had. It wasn't just about acting, about playing roles in films. It was about who she was, how she carried herself in an industry that often didn't have her best interests at heart. For the first time in a long while, Sandra felt like she could breathe again. The sting of the comments from the director had faded, but more importantly, she realized that she wasn't alone in this journey. Keanu's quiet support had reminded her that there were people out there who valued her for who she was, people who saw her beyond the roles she played on screen. However, as much as Sandra tried to move forward, the incident still lingered in the back of her mind. It wasn't about her own feelings anymore. It was about the message that the director had sent. Hollywood had always been a place where criticism and competition were part of the game, but there was something deeply unsettling about how easily some people could tear others down. It wasn't just a one-time thing. It was part of a larger culture of disrespect, something that seemed to run through the veins of the industry. Sandra had always prided herself on being a professional. She worked hard, showed up on time, and treated everyone with respect, from the biggest stars to the crew members behind the scenes. She knew that Hollywood wasn't a place for the faint-hearted, but she had always believed that kindness, authenticity, and hard work would eventually win the day. But now, after that night at the event, she wasn't so sure. It wasn't long before the opportunity to address the situation presented itself. Sandra and Keanu were set to meet again, this time for a casual dinner in Los Angeles. They often caught up over dinner when they weren't working on set, and this time was no different. As Sandra walked into the small, dimly lit restaurant where they had agreed to meet, she spotted Keanu sitting at a table in the corner, looking as relaxed as ever. When she sat down across from him, she could tell something was different. Keanu was quiet, his usual easygoing manner replaced by a calm intensity that Sandra hadn't seen before. "You okay?" she asked, eyeing him closely. Keanu glanced up, his eyes thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day," he began. "About that director. About the way people in this industry act sometimes. It's not right." Sandra sat back in her chair, surprised. "What do you mean?" Keanu leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "I've seen it too many times, people tearing each other down, stepping on others to get ahead. It's easy to ignore, especially if you're not the one it's happening to. But when you're the one it's happening to, it changes everything." Sandra nodded slowly. She had known that Keanu had always been the type to keep his opinions to himself, preferring to stay out of conflict. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how much the director's comment had affected not just her, but how it symbolized something bigger. "I've been thinking about it too," Sandra admitted. "It's just frustrating. You work so hard, you give everything, and then someone like that just dismisses you. It's like all the hard work doesn't matter." Keanu's expression softened. "It's not about them. It's about you. You've earned your place in this industry. You don't need anyone's approval to know that." Sandra took a deep breath. There was something about Keanu's unwavering belief in her that made her feel stronger, more certain about the path she was on. But despite all of that, something was still eating at her. "That's the thing," Sandra said slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "I don't think it's enough to just let it go. People like him, people who think they can just dismiss you or tear you down because they think they're better, they shouldn't be able to get away with it." Keanu didn't say anything for a moment, but when he spoke, his voice was firm. "Then you should stand up for yourself. Let him know that you're not going to tolerate that kind of behavior, not just for you, but for everyone who comes after you." Sandra raised an eyebrow. "You want me to confront him?" Keanu gave a small nod. "Not just confront him. Make it clear that what he said isn't acceptable. It's one thing for him to say something like that in passing, but it's another to let him get away with it. If we all just stay quiet, we're letting this toxic culture keep going. We're letting them think it's okay to treat people like that." Sandra felt a mix of emotions, surprise, hesitation, and a spark of determination. She had never been the type to engage in conflict, especially not in a way that would draw attention. But what Keanu was saying made sense. She had spent years in the industry, trying to do things the right way, always pushing forward with grace and professionalism. But sometimes grace wasn't enough. Sometimes you had to stand up for yourself even if it was uncomfortable. "I don't know," Sandra murmured, unsure. "I don't like the idea of causing a scene. I don't want it to look like I'm retaliating or making it personal." Keanu smiled softly. "It's not about revenge. It's about respect. You don't have to make it personal, but you do have to make it clear that what he did isn't okay. You deserve better, and so do the people around you. If you don't stand up, nothing will change." Sandra sat there for a moment, her thoughts swirling. She had never been one to seek conflict, but Keanu's words resonated with her. She had spent so much time trying to be the nice one, the one who didn't rock the boat. But maybe it was time to change that. Maybe it was time to make her voice heard, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been dismissed, belittled, or ignored. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, I'll do it. I'll talk to him." Keanu's smile grew wider. "That's the spirit." Sandra felt a mix of nerves and excitement. She didn't know exactly how the confrontation would go, but she knew one thing for sure. It was time to stop letting people walk all over her. She had earned her place in this industry, and it was time for her to defend it. A few days later, Sandra found herself face to face with the director once again. It was at another industry event, one that felt just as shallow and superficial as the last. But this time, Sandra was different. She had the support of someone who truly understood the value of standing up for what was right, and she wasn't going to let it slide. She spotted the director in the crowd standing near a group of colleagues. With a deep breath, she walked over to him, her steps confident and steady. The moment she approached, he looked up, a smile spreading across his face. "Good to see you again," he said, his tone casual. Sandra didn't waste any time. "We need to talk," she said, her voice calm but firm. The director's smile faltered slightly, a hint of surprise crossing his face. "Oh, what's this about?" "It's about the comment you made the other night," Sandra said, keeping her voice steady. "The one about my acting. I don't appreciate it, and I don't think it's something that should be dismissed." The director blinked, clearly taken aback. "I didn't mean it that way, Sandra. I was just—" "No," she interrupted. "You made it clear that you don't think I'm good enough. And I'm telling you that it's not okay to talk to people like that. Not in this industry and not in any other." There was a long pause as the director processed her words. Sandra stood her ground, waiting for his response. Finally, the director cleared his throat. I see. I didn't realize it had such an impact." Sandra nodded. "It did. And I'm letting you know that it's not something I'm going to just ignore." As she walked away, Sandra felt a sense of satisfaction. She had done it. She had confronted the person who had tried to diminish her, and she had done it with grace and confidence. And in that moment, Sandra realized that sometimes the biggest battles weren't fought on a movie set. They were fought in the quiet moments when you decided to stand up for yourself. After Sandra's conversation with the director, she felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't about proving anything to him or even getting an apology. It was about her own sense of self-respect. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was taking control of her own story. She wasn't just another person trying to survive in Hollywood. She was someone who could shape her own narrative. In the days that followed, Sandra noticed a subtle shift in the way people interacted with her. The director, though visibly uncomfortable after their conversation, didn't make any more dismissive comments. Instead, he became more professional, even respectful. It wasn't an instant transformation, but it was a start. Sandra knew that sometimes change took time. She wasn't expecting him to suddenly become her biggest supporter. But she did expect him to treat her with the basic decency that she deserved. But the real surprise came when she received a message from Keanu. It was a simple text. Just a few words, but it made Sandra smile. "You did the right thing. Proud of you." It was one of those small gestures that meant everything. Sandra had always known that Keanu had her back. But hearing those words, especially coming from him, made her feel stronger. She wasn't alone in this. She had allies, people who understood that standing up for yourself wasn't a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength. Over the next few weeks, Sandra threw herself back into her work, focusing on her upcoming projects. She kept her head down, blocking out any negativity, and concentrated on what she loved most: acting. There was a particular project that was close to her heart, a role she had been eyeing for years. It was a challenging character, one that required her to stretch her abilities in ways she hadn't done before. But Sandra was ready for it. She knew this role could push her career to new heights. The preparation for the role was intense. Sandra spent hours with the script, breaking down each scene, researching the background of her character, and even meeting with experts to understand the nuances of the character's experiences. It was one of those roles that demanded everything from her, and she was determined to give it her all. The effort was exhausting, but there was a fire inside her that wouldn't let her stop. During one of the rehearsals, Sandra was sitting with the director of the film, going over some of the finer details of her character's motivations. The director was a well-respected name in the industry, known for his attention to detail and his dedication to the craft. Sandra had heard great things about him, and she was eager to work with him. As they discussed the character, Sandra felt a sense of confidence that she hadn't felt in a long time. The director was listening to her ideas, asking her opinions, and even taking notes on how she envisioned the character. It was a refreshing change from the dismissiveness she had experienced in the past. "Honestly, Sandra, I think you're bringing something special to this role," the director said, his voice warm. "You're really digging deep, and it's showing in your work." Sandra smiled, grateful for the praise. But it wasn't just about hearing compliments. It was about feeling seen for who she truly was. In that moment, Sandra realized that this was what she had always wanted, an opportunity to work with people who respected her, not just for her fame, but for the craft she loved so much. However, there was still a part of her that wasn't fully at ease. Even though the director had been supportive, Sandra knew that the industry was still full of people who didn't always have her best interests at heart. She had seen it too many times, the way some people used others to get ahead, the way they took credit for work they didn't do, and the way they tried to tear down anyone who stood in their way. Sandra wasn't naive. She knew that she had to continue to protect herself, to stay true to her values, and to never let herself be taken advantage of. It wasn't just about surviving in Hollywood anymore. It was about thriving in a way that was true to who she was. Sandra had always been kind and professional, but now she was learning how to be firm when necessary. She had learned the value of speaking up, of not letting others walk all over her. But more than that, she had learned the importance of surrounding herself with people who truly had her back. People like Keanu, who didn't just offer support when it was convenient, but who stood by her when it mattered most. One evening, as she was sitting in her dressing room between takes, Sandra received a call from her agent. She answered the phone, expecting it to be a routine update about her schedule or a quick check-in. But when the agent spoke, Sandra could hear the excitement in their voice. "Guess what? You got the role," the agent said, barely able to contain their enthusiasm. Sandra's heart skipped a beat. This was the role she had wanted more than anything. It was the kind of character that could change everything for her, a role that would challenge her in ways she hadn't been challenged before. It was exactly the kind of project she had been hoping for. "Really?" Sandra asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. The director loved your audition, and they've decided to offer you the part. It's yours." A wide smile spread across Sandra's face. This was it. This was the moment she had been working for, the one that would take her career to the next level. But more than that, it was a reminder that she had earned this not just because of her talent, but because of her determination. She had stood up for herself when it mattered, and now she was reaping the rewards. As Sandra hung up the phone, she felt a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about landing the role. It was about what this role represented. It symbolized her growth, her ability to navigate the challenges of the industry, and her resilience. It was proof that hard work, authenticity, and standing up for what you believe in could lead to real success. Later that evening, she shared the news with Keanu. They had become close friends over the years, and Sandra always felt comfortable confiding in him. When she told him about the role, Keanu was thrilled for her. "That's amazing," he said. "I knew you'd get it. You deserve it." Sandra felt a rush of gratitude. "Thank you, Keanu. Honestly, your words meant more than you know. I couldn't have done it without your support." Keanu chuckled. "You don't need anyone's support to succeed. You've always had it in you. I just reminded you of that." As Sandra sat back and reflected on the journey she had been on, she realized how far she had come. The road hadn't been easy. There had been bumps, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But with each challenge, Sandra had grown stronger, more confident, and more sure of who she was and what she wanted. In the weeks that followed, Sandra dove headfirst into the role. The days were long, the work intense, but she felt alive in a way that she hadn't in a long time. She wasn't just acting. She was pushing herself to new limits, discovering new facets of her craft, and experiencing a deep sense of fulfillment. She also began to notice a subtle shift in the way people treated her. The director who had once made her feel small now sought her input on everything from her character's motivations to the overall direction of the film. Sandra wasn't just a nice actress anymore. She was an actress who knew her worth, who had earned respect, and who had the courage to stand her ground. Sandra's journey was far from over, but in that moment, as she stepped into her new role with confidence, she knew one thing for sure. She had finally found her place. Not just in Hollywood, but in the world. It wasn't about being the best, the most famous, or the most liked. It was about being authentic, about trusting herself, and about finding the people who would lift her up when she needed it most. And as the days passed, Sandra realized that in the end, success wasn't about the roles you played. It was about the person you became along the way. Time passed, and life slowly settled into a new rhythm for Sandra. Her latest film had wrapped, and the release was only a few months away. The buzz around it was growing every day. Reporters were talking about her performance, calling it one of the best of her career. Directors who had once overlooked her were suddenly calling her agent, eager to work with her. It felt good, but what made it even better was knowing that she had earned it honestly, through dedication and belief in herself. But fame, as Sandra had learned, was never the whole story. There were still quiet moments, those times when she would sit alone in her home away from the cameras and flashing lights, and think about everything that had led her to this point. The struggle, the criticism, the doubt, and the one moment at that party that had shaken her confidence more than she wanted to admit. And then she'd think about Keanu, how his calm words and quiet strength had changed everything for her. She remembered the night after she confronted the director. Keanu hadn't made a big deal about it. He didn't ask for details, didn't pry, didn't turn it into gossip. He just gave her a small smile and said, "I'm glad you did it. You deserve peace of mind." Those simple words had meant everything. It wasn't about revenge or even about being right, it was about dignity. And she understood that now more than ever. The months rolled on, and when the movie finally premiered, Sandra was nervous in a way she hadn't been for years. She had done so many films before, stood on countless red carpets and faced hundreds of interviews, but this one felt different. This movie wasn't just another job, it was personal. It was the first time she had walked into a project feeling completely in control, confident in her own skin. On the night of the premiere, the city lights shimmered like stars. Reporters called out her name, fans cheered from behind the barricades, and cameras flashed endlessly as she stepped out of the car. She smiled warmly, waved at the crowd, and paused for pictures. Despite the chaos, there was a calmness inside her. She didn't feel the pressure she used to feel. For once, she wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply proud of herself. As she walked up the carpet, she spotted Keanu standing off to the side, dressed simply as always. He wasn't there for publicity or attention. He was there for her. When their eyes met, Sandra couldn't help but laugh softly. "You made it," she said when she reached him. "Of course I did," Keanu replied with that familiar half-smile. "Wouldn't miss it." "Thank you," she said quietly. "For everything." He shrugged lightly. "You don't have to thank me. You did the hard part." They stood there for a moment, watching the photographers shout and the lights flash around them. Despite the noise, it felt peaceful. It was one of those rare moments when everything made sense. When the movie finally premiered inside the theater, the audience sat in complete silence. The story unfolded on screen, raw, emotional, and powerful, and Sandra poured her heart into every scene. By the time the credits rolled, the room erupted into applause. People stood on their feet, clapping and cheering. Sandra felt her throat tighten as tears filled her eyes. It wasn't about fame or awards, it was about the journey that had brought her here. Every setback, every doubt, every painful moment had led to this. Later that night, after the crowd had dispersed and the noise had faded, Sandra and Keanu found themselves sitting on a quiet balcony at the after-party. The music from inside was soft, drifting through the air, and the city below was glowing with life. Sandra leaned on the railing, looking down at the lights. "It's funny," she said after a long pause. "A year ago I was questioning everything. I almost let someone's careless words make me doubt myself." Keanu turned to look at her. "And now?" She smiled. "Now I don't care what they think. I care about what I think. That's all that matters." Keanu nodded. "That's how it should be." There was a silence between them, comfortable and unspoken. Then Sandra said, "You know, when you stood up for me that day, it meant more than you'll ever know." He shook his head. "I didn't do anything special. I just said what needed to be said." "You did more than that," she said softly. "You reminded me of who I am. You reminded me that kindness isn't weakness and that standing up for yourself doesn't make you difficult. It makes you strong." Keanu smiled faintly. "I think you always knew that. You just needed someone to remind you." Sandra looked at him, her eyes warm. "Maybe, but I'll never forget it." They sat there quietly for a while, watching the city lights shimmer in the distance. There was no need for more words. Their friendship had been tested and strengthened through something that could have easily broken a lesser bond. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was built on quiet loyalty, genuine care, and mutual respect. In the weeks that followed, the movie became a massive success. Critics praised Sandra's performance, calling it one of the finest of her career. Awards buzz surrounded her, but she didn't let it change her. She stayed grounded, grateful, and humble. In every interview, when asked about her success, she made it a point to mention the importance of kindness and integrity in Hollywood. She spoke about how people could choose to lift each other up instead of tearing each other down. And though she never mentioned names, those who knew her story understood who had inspired those words. At one particular event, a journalist asked her, "What do you think made you stronger after all these years in the industry?" Sandra paused, thinking. "People," she said finally. "The right people. The ones who remind you who you are when you forget. The ones who don't need to shout to make a difference. They're the reason I'm still here." It was a simple answer, but it carried so much truth. Everyone who heard it knew she meant it. Months later, when award season rolled around, Sandra was nominated for several major honors. The night of the biggest ceremony, she sat in her seat, her heart pounding. The air in the room was thick with anticipation as the presenter walked onto the stage and opened the envelope. When Sandra's name was called, she froze for a moment, disbelief washing over her. The applause was deafening as she made her way to the stage. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted the award, the golden statue shining under the bright lights. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "This means so much to me," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "But it's not just about this award. It's about the journey to get here. There was a time when I questioned if I even belonged in this industry. There were people who made me doubt myself, who made me feel small. But there were also people who lifted me up, people who believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself." Her eyes searched the audience until she found Keanu sitting quietly near the front. Their eyes met and she smiled. "This is for those people," she continued. "For the ones who remind you that kindness is strength, that compassion matters, and that you can still succeed without losing who you are." "Thank you." The audience rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. It was a moment of pure grace and gratitude, one that would be remembered for years. Later that night, when the event was over and the noise had died down, Sandra found Keanu waiting for her backstage. He smiled, that familiar calm expression on his face. "You did good," he said. Sandra laughed softly. "We did good." He raised an eyebrow. "I didn't win anything." "You don't need to," she said. "You've already changed everything." For a moment, they just stood there, smiling at each other. No grand speeches, no dramatic music. Just two people who understood what friendship and respect really meant. From that night on, Sandra's life felt different. Not because of the fame or the success, but because she had finally found peace. She didn't need to prove herself anymore. She had already done it by standing tall, speaking her truth and staying true to her heart. And Keanu, he stayed the same as always. Quiet, steady, kind. He never took credit, never sought attention, and never needed to. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. Years later, when people looked back on their friendship, they often talked about how unique it was. Two people who had shared the screen, shared struggles, and quietly supported each other through the highs and lows of Hollywood. It wasn't a story filled with drama or gossip. It was a story about genuine care, mutual respect, and how one person's kindness could truly change another's life. Sandra often said in interviews, "The world doesn't remember every award or every movie, but it remembers the people who made you feel seen, who made you believe in yourself again, and for me that person was Keanu." And every time she said it, she meant it, because when Sandra Bullock was insulted, it wasn't the insult that changed her. It was Keanu Reeves's quiet, unwavering response that changed everything.